And I was reading a ton of Faust at the time, and like The Crow, and just like super violent stuff.
My name's Ed Piskor,
I'm Jim Rugg.
and today we're doing things a little bit different, Jimmy, because I wanted to talk to somebody who wasn't alive when Nixon was president. Gerard Way. Not only is he a rock star, but he's the writer of Doom Patrol, Umbrella Academy,
Fabulous Killjoys.
On Raven's Wings, which we're going to have to talk about a lot, man. The spearhead of the Young Animal imprint, Gerard. Thanks for taking the time with us, brother.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Gerard, can I tell this story real quick, man?
Sure, go ahead.
It's
Yeah.
it's one of my personal introductions to you and the MC Army in particular, man. And it has to do with I'd say it was the year 2014. Free Comic Book Day is upon us, man. And Tom Scioli and I, we traveled up to Toronto, Canada, to go sign at the Beguiling. I had a Free Comic Book Day. Tom had a Free Comic Book Day, and takes 5-6 hours for us to get up there. We're running around while we're up there, not looking at our phones at all until it was like time to relax, chill out at the hotel room. We got a big day ahead of us tomorrow, a lot of comic book signing and all that. Log into my Twitter, and I got like 12,000 new followers, or like 2,000 new followers in a day, and all of these at replies, man, from people just like, "Yes, Gerard, I will." And it's it's a lot of girls with the hair coming over the one eye and shit like that, man. And you put a tweet out, man. It said like, if you guys pick up any Free Comic Book Day comics, like these are the two to pick up. And it was Tom's and it was mine. And so that whole day, crazy traffic on the Twitter. Then the next day comes, and then my Twitter broke again because all those same Gerard Way fans were just taking selfies like, "I got it, Gerard," and just like holding up the pictures of the comic. Your introduction and your sort of relationship with comics goes back a long ways, man. You worked at a comic shop, so I'm assuming you grew up a comics fan. You're born in '77, so is Jimmy, man. So I'm curious about the early days of like what hooked you.
Sure, yeah. The earliest thing I remember, comics wise, I was with my parents and me and my brother Mikey, and we were at somebody's house. I can't remember whose house it was, but they were a comic collector, and he let us like just take a bunch of Archie comics. So it was cool. It was really kind of my first exposure to comics. I was very young, and so I really enjoyed those. But then there was what kind of really got me into them was when I had my tonsils taken out in the 3rd grade. And so, you got to go to the hospital, and like they tell you they're going to give you ice cream and stuff to get you excited about it. But like you wake up and you're in like this incredible weird pain, and you don't want ice cream, and you just really want to pee. And it is what it is. But my grandmother had got me one of those like 3-packs that come in the plastic. The only comic I fully remember being in that 3-pack was a Captain America comic. And so that kind of started, and she got me a Super Pickle too. So he was a superhero. So then, I really got into X-Men because we had a corner store, and my mom would let us walk to the corner store, and we would usually get like wax packs of like cards and stickers from movies and stuff like that. And then, but they had this, this wall of comics. And I remember I picked up an X-Men Classics and a current issue of X-Men. I don't remember the very first issue, but it was Claremont and Silvestri. Right around then, too, was when Inferno happened. And I was really into that. Like, I was reading a lot of the Inferno comics. I was reading Exterminators, which I loved. I was reading X Factor, X-Men, Daredevil, and I just loved the whole thing. I loved Inferno. And it was right around then, or a little earlier, I started to draw my own comics and make these little kind of comics myself about this character named Icicle, who He was like he was basically like a ripoff of Iceman, you know.
I was going to say Human Torch, but that was just going to be a guess.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that Silvestri X-Men era, that's exactly when I start buying X-Men too. So we've
Yeah.
had, we've talked to other cartoonists, and that age thing is there's such a parallel. Like we all have that common experience of a
Mhm.
certain age whenever we all sort of enter that. So I am excited to hear this progression because I feel like it's going to sound very familiar to me.
Yeah.
Like we're a part of what I call like the last vestige of the newsstand comic buyer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that corner store.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. So we'd go like once a week and I'd see whatever they had but I was like always waiting for that X-Men issue. That was like the big one. And I loved so much about it. Like I loved the fact that they didn't show up in photographs. They basically didn't exist. So they wouldn't get any of the credit for saving the world. And they were mutants, so they were all outcasts and I just loved the whole thing about it. And I guess I felt like a little bit of an outcast too. So I really related to that. And I'm sure a lot of other kids my age at the time were really relating to that element. Because the chances were if you were reading X-Men at that age, you probably weren't a popular kid in school. So
I would take that bet.
yeah.
That Inferno was also that was the era of the Ann Nocenti, John Romita Jr. Daredevils. They were firing on all cylinders, man.
That's another strong run in my collection.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of what age I am. So I'm reading that stuff. But then, oh, yeah, this is how here's where a shift happened. So then I'm in middle school and I try out for marching band because I just thought it was something you're supposed to do because I was in school orchestra and I played the drums. I played snare, so I tried out, and as a middle schooler, I actually got into the high school program. I had a miserable time. I hated it. I quit right away. I only lasted. I went to band camp, and it was so miserable. And I just they would wake you up at 5 a.m. to just play the snare drum and do snare rolls for an hour, and I didn't see the point. And then we were walking together. They're trying to teach us how to march together to make shapes and shit like that. And then the guy was just yelling at everybody and demeaning everyone. And I was like, what the fuck is this? What's the point of this? I'm not doing this. So I went home and I quit. But before I quit, another thing about band camp too, I was really into bands like the Misfits. The Misfits were really huge to me. And basically my musical tastes got zero respect in marching band. They were all about Led Zeppelin and stuff like that, and the Doors and all that stuff. And I was listening to the Misfits, and so they would bag on my musical tastes all the time. And anyway, but before I quit, I met this kid named Russell who played trombone. And I was telling him about the comics I read, and I was like, yeah, I really like X-Men. He's like, you need to read Watchmen. He was like, that's the real deal. And I was like, oh, all right. I'd never heard of it. I had no idea that it existed. So I went to a bookstore at the mall with my parents, and they had it, and they bought it for me. And that changed everything then. For a lot of people, same thing, And I was just like, this is the greatest thing ever. So it was not long after that, I also then discovered Dark Knight Returns, and I went down that path. But also a cool thing that happened at the time, my elementary school friend Anthony had a sister, Sharon, who was a drummer, and she actually helped me get into SVA. She took all the photos for my portfolio. And she would show us stuff like Love and Rockets and Hate and comics like that, and neat stuff and stuff like that. So I was exposed to underground comics as well. So I had a little interest in that. But I read Watchmen, and that kind of changed everything. And then I read Dark Knight Returns, and then I think I read Daredevil Born Again. And so it was around this time that I discovered Watchmen. So my the summer of my middle school, 8th grade going into 9th grade into high school, that summer I would walk pretty far to this comic shop, really small, in Bloomfield Center, and it was called Metropolis Comics. But it wasn't like Metropolis, like Superman Metropolis. It was like the old movie, and they had like this, and they had this sign, and it was like the same lettering as the Fritz Lang movie.
Wow.
Which I had never heard of at the time, and I would discover. But I walked in, and there was a guy, another kid. He must have been like 17. I think he was a senior in high school. His name was Scott, and I was wearing my Watchmen shirt, and then we just started talking about Watchmen, you know. And he went into like this big, deep discussion about Watchmen, and I was like, "This is where I belong." These are the you know.
How deep were you, man? Because I seem to remember reading somewhere that you're an RPG guy, man. So were you in?
Yeah.
Were you fucking with that Watchmen RPG book?
Yeah, I owned it. I actually, unfortunately, lost it. But that book, discovering that book was like the greatest thing, because there was all this extra information in that West End. It was Mayfair published it, and there was all this information in there, like stuff that I didn't even know about the comic, and I was like, this is like the greatest companion to Watchmen, you know.
Did Alan Moore have something to do with that? Like, I've never rested my eyes on a copy of that.
I don't know, but I want to say I think so, because there's a lot of information that's not in the graphic novel that's in there that seems pretty legit.
Dig.
You know. So yeah.
So Metropolis Comics, that's the same shop you're going to end up working in a few years later?
Yeah. It was, and then I met my best friend Sean there, and it was cool because you had a group of like teenagers. So you had like kids like us, we're about 15, 16, so on. And then there was these older guys who were into RPGs and comics. Like some of them were in their late 20s, 30s, and they would totally tolerate us, you know? And like we'd have every day, I would walk there every day, and we would just have these like deep discussions about stuff, about comics. And every night there was a role-playing game. There was an RPG. And you basically would choose which game you wanted to play, and then you would just show up at night to play that game, you know? And we were like, you know, us 15-year-olds were like super immature, and I'm really surprised they tolerated us as much as they did, because, you know, we were like, we're not the best players, you know? But to backtrack on role-playing games, I had first played Dungeons and Dragons in the 3rd grade. And so I've been interested in them since the 3rd grade. But now I found a place where I could play every night, you know? So my mom was cool. I had a curfew, but she would kind of like, she would let me walk there every day, and then it would be nighttime, and then she would pick me up. And we played everything from like Palladium Supers, Call of Cthulhu, which I didn't understand at the time. I didn't know how to play that game. I was trying to play that game as if you were playing Dungeons and Dragons and just try to kill everything, but that's not how Call of Cthulhu works. You know, you basically end up dead, you know? So, but this leads me into writing my first comic. So there's a Palladium Superheroes game, and I come up with this character named Night Reaper. And he was like this guy in a black hooded cloak. He had skull makeup on, because again, I was a big Misfits fan, so everything was about skull makeup for me. And he had like this double scythe and this costume, and the way he was a normal guy, but the way he would turn into his costume is like all this blood would drip down him, and then he'd be in the costume.
That's sick.
Yeah. So then I'm at a pep rally. I think now I'm 16. I had been working at the shop, and I meet this other kid who's older than me. He's a grade above me, named Jose. And he's like the best artist in the school, just straight up. But he also wasn't a part of like trying to be like in the yearbook as best artist and stuff like that. He was doing his own thing, and he was drawing these really amazing kind of comics that are, I'd say they were like part of what was going on in Extreme Studios or like Image at the time. It was very much that kind of superhero team. You got a big guy You got a Wolverine guy. You've got, so we came up with one of those called Chaos Incorporated. And we hit it off immediately, Jose and I, and we only lived like 2 blocks from each other. So he would come to the house, we'd sit in my mom's kitchen, and we just came up with stories. We just came up with all this stuff. And then we would go to comic conventions. My dad would take us, and we would dress up in like blazers and button up shirts.
Super pro, man.
Yeah. And we even had badges that we made for our studio, which was called Twilight's End. And we would wear these badges and basically shopped around comics, this Chaos Incorporated comic. There was one time I remember running into Rob Liefeld, and I gave him the script to issue 1 of Chaos Inc. And he was very nice. He took it, but I had pretty much figured there was no way he was going to read that,
That's pretty substantial. How many pages was this comic? It sounds like a fully formed idea, complete.
Yeah. So largely because of Frank Miller and how Dark Knight Returns impacted me, I went upstairs. My grandparents lived upstairs. We lived in like a duplex. And I asked her if I could use her typewriter. So at that point, I started typing out these comics, full scripts, They weren't super detailed. It was basically kind of like action. I don't even know if I was doing panel breakdowns. I think I was. It was like action and dialogue and some direction and things like that. And then Jose would draw them. And so we were shopping Chaos Inc. And then we ended up going to another publisher. And that's where Night Reaper became the Fawn City Butcher. And that leads to On Raven's Wings. And it becomes more extreme. And extreme in a violent way. Like it's like definitely part of those, what do they call them, outlaw comics at the time, right? It's definitely in that world. It started off as this superhero named Night Reaper. And then it turned into this thing. And I was reading a ton of Faust at the time. And like The Crow and just like super violent stuff.
That is such an interesting era because to give listeners context that may not be familiar, 1993 is kind of the apex of the bubble. So 1992 sees 91 sees X-Men sell 8 million copies. 91 sees those popular Marvel artists start Image in 1992, and then 1993 is kind of the full-on bubble of like every kind of comic you can imagine. Probably as many comics as we've seen.
Right.
Interesting time period. Gerard, you mentioned typing out your script. Had you seen examples of this? Like, it makes sense now. We know how this process works, but for a 15 or 16-year-old, that seems like a pretty high mountain to climb. Had you seen examples of comic book scripts?
That's a really good question. I'm trying to remember if I did. Because back then they weren't sharing that kind of information. Like nowadays, they'll put scripts in the back of special editions and stuff like that. But I don't remember really seeing a script, But I did have panel breakdowns and description. And I don't know if I had seen. I don't remember the original Dark Knight Returns graphic novel. Did that have script pages in the back? I can't remember.
Think so.
No.
Yeah, that's pretty great.
What I think might have happened though is I think Arkham Asylum might have had some script pages in the back. I'm trying to remember because that was a big influence on me too. Grant and Dave's Arkham Asylum. So when the Image boom was happening, I was actually into totally different comics at the time. So I was making like these underground violent comics, and I was reading Grant's Doom Patrol, and I was into that stuff. And I discovered Vertigo, and those are my kind of comics, not the mainstream superhero stuff anymore. Like I had totally moved away from that stuff, and that all started with Watchmen. But then Jose and I we're making comics.
What's the circulation on Raven's Wings 1? Like, do you have any sense? 5,000? I mean, that was a crazy period where, an average person could sell 30,000, given all the comic shops that were out there, get 1 or 2 copies a piece. You could hit those numbers pretty easy.
Yeah, I think there was a lot. You know, I got a box of comps or two. I can't even remember how many boxes, and it was a ton of them, you know. And it was, yeah, it was the boom. So like there was another local comic shop I wasn't too crazy about, even closer to me, but like all these number one issues would just be up on the wall, you know, no matter what it was. Like everybody was just ordering number ones. That was the big thing, you know.
You were still a kid, but when I was young, I had some friends who were in like BMX professionals and sponsored people, and they would go touring for BMX events. So I wondered, like, did you take On Raven's Wings to any conventions outside of Jersey, New York?
Yes, we did cons, you know, and I can't even remember. Like, I would just meet somebody that had a con, or you know, because you'd have to. There was no email or anything, so I would just like. I would like ask whoever was throwing a particular convention that I went to. So me and Jose would start going to these smaller cons now. And I would talk to somebody who was running the convention. Sometimes these were like pretty young people, like in their 20s and stuff, just throwing these comic conventions. And then I would give them our book, and then they would invite us to come to the next con, you know? And it was an amazing experience. Like, it was cool how welcoming that underground scene was to like a 15-year-old, you know? I don't know if it was the novelty of the fact that here's a 15-year-old writing hyper violent comics with like ripped off Pantera lyrics in it. And, you know, I don't know what it was, but they were all cool to me, you know?
It's very amusing to me to think of like finding that kind of comic with a 15-year-old at a show. Like that's such a strange picture.
Gerard, this is the part of the show when whenever it's mentioned that there are Faust readers who are 14 years old or 12 or whatever, this is the part where we encourage the listeners to support the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and pledge some donations, man, because we all seem to have gotten these comics way before we were supposed to. Somebody was selling them to us, and it just takes one lone bored hillbilly mom to screw up a whole store.
Yeah, you know, you guys were, I just want to get the name correctly. Yeah, David Quinn. Yeah, and Tim Vigil. So I got a couple stories about them.
Let's hear
it. I meet Tim Vigil at a con, and I had saved up all my money to ask him for a commission. And he was like, "What do you want?" And I was like, "I want Faust killing Wolverine." Which I'm sure he got that like so many times. And he was just too booked up. He was like, no, like, I don't think he was very interested in drawing that, you know? But then David Quinn, the writer, he foolishly gave me his phone number. And I would call him all the time for advice. And it would, you could totally tell, like I would call him up, and he was in Ann Arbor, I think. I think so. I would call him up, and immediately when he heard it was me, because nobody had call ID at that point or anything, you know, you could just hear his voice just like deflate. And I would totally bother him until eventually I kind of got the message that he probably didn't want to be talking to a 15-year-old, asking him about comic stuff, you know. And then another story is I met Garth Ennis when Preacher #1 came out, and I gave him my comic, and he wrote me back. He wrote me a letter, and that was super cool of him. Yeah, he sent it to my house. I don't even know how he found my address. I think I probably gave him my address, you know, on a card, because I had cards, you know.
At the beginning of a career, man, there are so few rewards, and it's such a uphill battle that I feel like the first sort of positive steps moving forward really is just engaging in correspondence with people who have inspired you. Like there's something about that back and forth that just provides a little bit of that battery in the back, as we say, man, to just keep on grinding. How about James O'Barr, man?
Oh my God. Yeah. I love The Crow. I love The Crow, you know. That was huge. And then like the movie came out too, and that was friggin' awesome. That was such a good adaptation.
Trent Reznor soundtrack.
Yeah, like the whole soundtrack was incredible. It was the first soundtrack I remember like that, where they made it like this really great mix of music. It was the first, and after that, everybody started doing that, where they started, all right, well, let's find cool bands to do this stuff. You know, it's the first time I remember a soundtrack having that big an impact. You know?
Were you seeing this like at the comic store that you worked at? Were you know these comics that you're describing, Crow, Faust, some of the darker,
Yeah.
violent indie stuff? Was that
Yeah.
going on at your comic store? Like, were people coming through and buying that stuff? Were they popular?
There was like mostly it was the people that were very connected to the store that were into that stuff. So like the people that either worked there or hung out there a lot and played the RPGs and read comics, a lot of those guys were reading that stuff. But a lot of people that were coming in off the street into the shop were reading the mainstream stuff, you know? And then when you would have like these booms that were super annoying, like when they killed Superman, the death of Superman, like you would just get people coming out of the woodworks trying to buy that comic, to the point where even though the shop was making money, it was super irritating because we weren't into that stuff, but we had to sell it to people to like keep the shop open, you know? And everything was polybagged or gold foil, like all these gimmick covers. And these people would come in. There was a guy who would frequent the shop who bought something like 500 copies of Pit #1.
He put his kids through college with that. What you talk about, man? Gerard, how do you discover SVA?
Actually, I discovered SVA through my friend Anthony's sister Sharon, who was the drummer that I mentioned. So she was super cool. Like she was kind of like a big sister, and she was definitely like the coolest person I had ever met for many years. She was a drummer. She was a photographer who would take promo shots for hair metal bands, and she introduced us to all these Fantagraphics comics. She went to SVA, so that's how I heard about the school. And I wanted to go there from a pretty young age, you know? And it's around this time, so like we stopped doing On Raven's Wings. We only did 2 issues, but then like what happened was Jose, he was a senior in high school, and he really kind of had a focus that senior year because I think he had some requirements. And whenever you become a senior in high school, at least back then, you're always wondering if you're going to graduate. Like you get super concerned with that, especially if your grades aren't spectacular, you know? So he had to focus on school. So we never finished On Raven's Wings. And then, but it's around this time that I really start to take seriously drawing my own stuff, you know?
Before we get too far from Jose,
Yeah.
did he go on to do any other comics work? Is he still around comics? Do you know?
He didn't, to my knowledge. Like I don't know if he eventually put out something else, and we lost touch some years ago. But I love him, and I love the work we did together, and he's still one of my favorite artists of all time. You know, what he would do a lot, and we would do this together. Sometimes he would do it alone. We did a lot of development work together, just tossing ideas around, and he would do these wonderful. Like. Concept drawings of characters, like just stunning stuff, you know? And his style, it wasn't like the Image stuff. He had like there was like a touch of this kind of like European comic art to his stuff because he was from Spain. And so he also brought in this European comics flavor, you know? Yeah, and he was brilliant, you know? Like I got really lucky meeting him.
Who were some of the people that were in your class when you went to SVA, man? We've been talking to a bunch of people on the channel, and the rival dojo Kubert School comes up a bunch, man. So
yeah,
you're the first SVA cat, man. So who?
Oh, well, I went and checked out. Here's why I ended up ultimately going to SVA. So I also really wanted to go to the Kubert School, and my parents took me. We did a tour.
Because you're from Jersey.
Yeah, Jersey. Yeah. So we did a tour of the Kubert School, and I was like, this is it. I was like, if I want to become a real deal comic artist, like this is where I have to go, you know? But the thing about Kubert School is you didn't get a degree.
Right.
So, because there was just comic classes, you know, and just writing. And they told us how brutal it was going to be. Like, you'd be drawing constantly and you have to finish entire comics. And I was like, that's what I want. But my parents, it was really important to them that I got a degree. And since they were the ones taking out the loans, it was, you know, and making the payments, they were like, you have to go to SBA. So then Sharon, who I mentioned, she took photographs of my portfolio. By this time, too, before we get into SBA, like by this time in high school, I'm in like a 3-4 period art class called commercial art. And they let you work on whatever you wanted to work on. There was a kid who was a photographer. They were all different artists. There was a girl who was a painter. And basically that class was to get you ready to show your portfolio to an art school.
That's dope.
Yeah, it was dope. And really, really lucky to have that at Belleville High, you know?
What would your portfolio comprise? What kind of stuff?
It was, all right, so in high school, it was a lot of, some of it were just like illustrations, but some of it were comic pages. Because another thing I was doing in high school, I would make these short comics that were 1 page long. I would go to a place to photocopy them, and then I would stick them randomly in people's lockers. You know, until ultimately that got me in trouble.
Like, can't go any other way.
Yeah. So I got into trouble, but my art had really, in my opinion at the time, had really come a long way. Like, and I was able to draw my own stuff. And so that helped me get into SBA. I showed them my portfolio. Yeah, it was like comic pages. One of them was like a milk and cheese parody with 2 clowns. Because I love milk and cheese too.
Shouts to Evan Dorkin.
Yep, shout out. So then I get an SBA, and I'm trying to. So the thing about SBA though, and this was kind of a bummer to me, like your first year is called foundation year, and you don't do anything related to your major. They make you take everything, because I guess their whole thing was like, we want to see if you gravitate towards something else, you know. So I had to take photography, and since you got a degree, I had to take literature classes, and I did life drawing, and I did painting, and they make you do everything. And I'm actually really grateful for that, you know.
Is this the year where you would take like a comedy class?
Oh, comedy class came a little bit later, but I took that because that class I think fulfilled one of the college electives.
Dig.
Sits in above writing, yeah.
Did you go during that period where like Walt Simonson and Klaus Janson are the teachers? Mazzucchelli, like who were your teachers at the school? And once again, who were some of the people that were in your class that we know from comics and whatever?
Yeah. My teachers were. This was Joe Orlando. I did life drawing with Joe Orlando. So this is when you get into the second year. You know, first year is foundation, but second they throw you into your major. So Joe Orlando, we did life drawing with him, and applying that to comics. Sal Amendola would teach us like inking, and Carmine Infantino taught us layouts, and then Klaus Janson taught us how to make a graphic novel.
Gerard, if you wouldn't have made something of yourself after that pedigree, we'd have to cut promos on you, dude.
Well, there's this famous story that Peter Bagg went to SBA, and Joe Orlando told him that he would never make it in comics.
We hear all those stories, man. Drew Friedman had Will Eisner tell him to quit drawing with dots.
And I also had one of the relationships I ended up forging with a teacher was Joey Cavalieri.
Oh yeah, editor at DC Comics.
Yeah. And he was just the greatest guy. He would let me ask him a ton of questions. He would teach comic writing. So that's really where I learned how to write comics, you know. And Klaus, too, because Klaus would make you do scripts, too.
Cavalieri was a very kind of courageous editor for DC Comics. You know, there was, I think he might have done the Bizarro
I think that was him.
comic,
Bizarro,
and then he brought Pete Bagg in to do Sweatshop. And
I was
like,
going
a
to
lot of
say,
interesting
anybody that
stuff.
doesn't know, Bizarro was like getting alternative and indie cartoonists to do comics featuring DC characters in kind of an offbeat way. So kind of an interesting project.
That's kind of where I got. I was influenced by that Bizarro book when I went to Young Animal. So my idea when I went to Young Animal is I want to get some cool underground artists and have them do the superhero stuff. And that was so Joey's Bizarro comics was a big influence on that, you know.
That's super cool. So I have to assume that because you spin a lot of plates, man. The major that you were studying for it was comics.
It was cartooning illustration, yeah. That was my major. I even had Dame Darcy as a teacher.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
What would her class be?
I had no idea she was in New York. I always think of her as West
Seattle.
Coast, but I may be wrong about that too.
Yeah. It was crazy. It was like really imaginative. It almost had the feelings of a crafts class. Like she was just like really supportive, and the way she thought about stuff was like really different from everybody else. And she would show us her meat cake comic, and we would just be like, whoa, what is this? So she was a lot of fun, We learned some things from her too.
Was James Jean in your class?
He was, but he was not in my classes. He was a year or two ahead. So I think we were at SVA at the same time, but I think he graduated. I'm trying to think of the people in my class. Farrell was in my class.
Farrell Dalrymple, Popular War.
And I always knew he was going to make it because he was always drawing. Always.
He stayed here in Pittsburgh for like a month and filled up an entire one of those hardcover sketchbooks.
Yeah.
In 30 days.
And every page is spectacular.
Yeah, so I had Farrell in this what was it, surrealist literature class, I think it was. And, he was drawing all the time, and he was really amazing. Dave Roman was another.
Was Raina in your class? Raina Talbot?
No, she wasn't in my class. She was, I think, a year below me.
Dig.
But she was going there at the time, too.
And how about Becky Cloonan?
Becky Cloonan was I never had any classes with Becky. I think she was another student that was a little bit behind in the years.
There are these waves, the Kubert School works this way too. There are like 2 or 3 like big waves, and your era they're in like the late 90s, we'll say. That was like one of the last big waves, like Dash Shaw comes later. One or two other people, man, but like your late 90s class, man, a lot of impeccable talent came out of that, and I sort of it would be interesting to reverse engineer and try to figure out what was in the water, what was influencing all the kids who were growing up then.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you what I was reading. There was a comic shop to and from the PATH train, because I had to commute every day. Like, we couldn't afford to put me in the dorms. So I would have to get up at like 5:30, 6 a.m. and take the commuter train to the PATH train, get off on 23rd, and just walk, But there was a comic shop to and from the PATH train, and that's when I discovered Paul Pope. And that kind of changed everything for me too.
That's a guy who there's a generation that really drew a lot from Paul Pope. He shows up with that ink brush technique, with European and manga influences, just a lot of stuff that it seems like, I don't know, several years worth of, maybe a decade of cartoonists that followed him, really big influence on a lot of us.
It's that generation too. Like Gerard totally hit the nail on the head. Like as soon as he said it, I'm like, I think of Farrell uses a big thick brush, and the only person using that super thick line was Paul Pope at that moment. And Becky too, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and I was reading THB was the one coming out at the time, and I think, and then of course Escapo, which had a huge impact on me. But Paul Pope I got pretty fearless with the brush after being introduced to his stuff, because I was a bit afraid of it, and I never took to the nibs very much. Like Sal Amendola would have us use these nibs for inking, and I hated it, but I really took to the brush once I saw Paul's stuff.
Thinking of it historically, Pope is sort of the anti-image. Like, all those image dudes swore by that Hunt 102 pen nib, and they, and probably could go back to like Art Adams and Terry Austin as being their forefathers in that regard. Pope was very much an alternative to that approach of, the
Yeah.
little noodling sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
The other thing that comes out of that generation is I start to see artists bringing in manga. Becky Cloonan comes to mind
Yeah.
as one of those early prominent cartoonists that did that. Were you seeing manga, and were you seeing things like, were the other students in your class, were you guys all like sharing what you're looking at, and was there a lot of energy around that part of it?
There was a little bit of that, from what I remember. Becky was, to me, the first person that married manga with the American style, and I guess you could say that Paul was technically doing that too. I mean, there's even that story where I guess he was living in Japan for a few years and he created all these comics that the company never put out.
Yeah,
like,
did some stuff for Kodansha,
yeah,
the Akira publisher.
But Becky is one of the first people I remember that was doing that. That was kind of also, but in a totally different way from Paul Pope,
right.
Was marrying manga with an American kind of art style. I'm trying to think of what it was like in my class. There wasn't one thing that I picked up from this other student that completely changed the way I drew was blue pencil. There's this one student, he was definitely the best in the class. He would do everything in blue pencil. And then that's when I said, let me try this blue pencil thing. And it totally changed everything for me,
What are the virtues of the blue pencil? I use it as well, and
yeah.
for me, it's simply a time-saving mechanism. I churn out all the pages on my own, so any time that I can save from erasing or whatever is time well spent. Once it adds up to 100 pages or whatever, man. So what's the virtues of the blue pencil for you?
I just liked the way that it felt on the page. There's something about blue pencil, and they're a bit different now. Like, some of them are, but like it's also pretty light. Yeah, I just really liked it, and also you didn't have to erase. It made the inks look really good over the blue pencil. They would have this look to them, even though the blue would never show up. The actual pages, and I still love seeing pages like that. Nick Darrington's pages are like that.
He does. What?
That comes to mind.
We got to get to Nick and your artist in a minute, man. But do you know who else comes to mind, man?
Chris Ware.
Chris Ware, baby.
Yeah.
Because he gets.
I was reading that too.
Acme Novelty Library.
Yeah, that was another thing I would get at the shop. It was basically Paul Pope at Acme Novelty Library.
Slim pickings in those late 90s, man. I often think, like, what the heck I was going to the store every week. What the heck was I buying? and the truth was, I was digging deep and getting old issues of Love and Rockets that I didn't have, or,
right.
8 Balls.
Yeah, I think I was probably Savage Dragon and Stray Bullets, Sin City,
yeah.
Late 90s.
Stray Bullets was a big one for me too.
Did you guys do anything with digital tools in the late 90s? Because that's whenever I first, Photoshop first enters my life. I was in school 95 to 99 studying graphic design, and I started to learn, Quark Express, but right. Photoshop was the big one that's still around.
Right. Unfortunately, unless you took the computer art class, you weren't exposed to any of that stuff. Because it was like digital coloring was just starting to kind of take off. Mm-hmm. And really graphic designers at SVA learn that stuff, so you basically have to kind of take the graphic design course to learn how to use Photoshop. So when I was at SVA, everything was a traditional tool, absolutely everything.
It was so close to that convergence between analog and digital, and I come a little bit later. I go to school in 2000 at the Kubert School, and they were teaching us paste ups and mechanicals, but people were like, if you wanted a job, you better know Quark and shit. So I got mad, like, you're teaching me all this old stuff and I can't even get a job with this. Little did I know that it would factor into my production process with like the old style looking comics that I've drawn in the future, man. But what years were you there at SVA?
I graduated a year or two before 9/11, so I think 99 I graduated.
Dick.
Yeah, but that's interesting you bring up the digital component and learning the old techniques, because there was a couple students that were taking those computer classes and they were warning us, and they were saying, like, you're not going to get a job when you leave this school if you don't know how to use this stuff. And me and a lot of other people were really resistant to digital art, you know. And so this is also, so this is post 90s boom as well.
Sure.
This is the tail end of it. So when we all get out of school, there's no jobs.
Comics were bleak in the late 90s and early 2000s, man. It was like before the graphic novels and manga show up, that was like a bottom time period for that stuff.
Yeah. And that's what we all graduated into, was this period of comics where they were worthless. Now all the Death of Superman issues people bought were worthless, and they weren't hiring any new people, you know. And it was really hard, and I hit the pavement for like a good couple years.
What kind of stuff, like what was the, I don't know, the dream, or what were you pitching in a portfolio at that point?
At that time, I would, you know, all right, so the way I had contacts with it at DC was through Joey Cavalieri. And in my senior year at SVA, he got me an internship at DC. And I basically worked in the FedEx room and did that. And I also would run the photocopier. And so I would see all this original art. Like I remember getting Steve Dillon art and photocopying it, you know, and so I could bring the stapled copies to the editors and they could make their notes and stuff. So that really, I learned a bit just from looking at original art, as you can, you know. So I you know, there's like some editors I would know just from working there, and I was trying to, at the time, I think I was trying to get a Superman gig. I went astray for a bit. There was a hot minute when I got out of school, because the only real paying gigs were drawing superheroes. So I was like, all right, I guess I'm gonna. So like all the really fun, artistic Paul Pope stuff kind of went away for me. And then it was like me doing Superman. And I'm trying, even though there's a bit of a European influence in my art at the time, I'm trying to do the mainstream thing. And it's just not working. And I couldn't get a job. I got one job, but I think it was Andy Helfer hired me to do a big book page. And it was super nice of him.
Do you remember which book it is?
Yeah, it's Big Book of the Weird Wild West. And I did I can't remember the name of the strip, but I did a page. And it was inked by a friend of mine, Joe, because I had run out of time and we needed it inked. But he only got like a special thanks in the back. There was some kind of editorial issue, like, but he had inked that piece. And that was it. That was the only job I got. So then I'm hitting the pavement. I'm also going to Marvel, and I'm doing Spider-Man pages, and I'm like, I need a job. My parents are like, you need a job, you know? And I'm like, but I give up at some point in a good way, and I get back to my like indie roots. And then I start drawing this black and white comic about two piano movers. And it's called The Amazing Gofo Brothers Piano Movers Extraordinaire. And this is something that I do with my friend Stu. And we kind of work on the story together. He would write the scripts, and then I would draw it. So that was me. That was my first, since I was a 15-year-old, this is my first pitch. This comic, I put everything into it, and I loved it. And I felt like I was really drawing as my true self. You know, this felt like the real stuff I was interested in. And it was indie. And then we basically went around and just gave people, we made this really nice pitch with art and everything. And I got a really nice rejection from Fantagraphics. Basically, we got rejected, all the stuff, you know. And then I found a job as a toy designer in Hoboken.
That's a mythical place, this toy design place in Hoboken, because a lot of Kubert School students end up there too, man. I think they would even do McFarlane figures at a certain point.
Yeah, it was called Funhouse, and really cool people. And I was working on Marvel stuff. So I was doing turnarounds for Marvel stuff. One of the big things I worked on there, aside from toy development, they actually let me develop my own toys and lines and stuff like that. So they were really cool, and I get paid to do that. But I was working on, this is right when they started the Spider-Man and Friends preschool line of toys. So I was working on those figures. I was doing like Girl Spider-Man and, superheroes. And I did Daredevil. And I got really upset with Toy Biz because they wanted his eyes to be blue, big blue eyes. Yeah. And I got very upset about it because I was like, Daredevil you can't see Daredevil's eyes, and he's blind, and they're supposed to be white, and it's supposed to be kind of scary. And but they were like, no, it's gonna scare kids. We have to give them eyes. That was upsetting.
Gerard, when you say you developed lines, would this be at the concept stage and with the potential that these things would then be sculpted? Like how far would that stuff go?
A lot of it never went to sculpt, but I drew my ass off during this period, like stacks of toy designs. Either the turnarounds that I was doing for Toy Biz, because basically Toy Biz would farm it out to this funhouse place. So I was doing tons of drawings every day, and I got paid really well for it. And I was developing my own lines. One of them was a fantasy line. I can't remember the name of it, but I was trying to incorporate some of my Dungeons and Dragons love into an actual toy line for kids, and it was called Quest. That's what it was called. And basically there was this big thing that almost looked like the thing. It was a combination treehouse and the thing from Dark Crystal in Agra's place with the big, I don't even know what that's called, with the spheres. And it looked like that, and you would take a figure, and the idea was you put the figure on the base of this thing, and then you would get a quest. And they give you a quest, and then you would have to kill like orcs or something, So it was very fantasy based. That was the one I put a lot into. But it was right here. So what was happening while I was working this really great, well-paying toy job, the band starts to take off. This is right when that happens.
All through school, you're also playing music?
Yeah, I'm in little bands here and there, all through art school. Yeah, and even back in the day, like I used to run ads in the East Coast Rocker at 15, looking for other musicians to play with. And I would get on the phone with these musicians, and they were like, they could tell I was 15, and then they would just like hang out, like no way. But I know, so music had been like this secret passion, kind of this thing that I was about like 13 or 14. I was in this band with these two kids, and then I wasn't a great guitarist, so they kicked me out. So that's actually really when I said to myself, all right, well, that dream's dead. I'm going to be a comic artist. And I taught myself how to draw, but throughout the years, I just kept starting little bands. And there was this pop punk band called Nancy Drew that I was writing songs for, and we would play it, but there wasn't a lot of dedication, because people were in other bands, and, it would be hard to get it was hard to get people to commit to being in a band with me, until years go by, we all graduated, everybody's moved on. And then I started to reach out to people who had kind of moved on and had normal jobs now, which is how I got in touch with our first drummer, Matt, and how I reached out to Ray Toro, who would then play guitar in My Chemical Romance. So some time had passed. Everybody had graduated. We were all hitting the pavement. We're all working, good or lousy jobs. And that's kind of when I pulled a band together. And so we got this big break opening up for Jimmy Eat World at the Allentown Fairground. And that was something like 6,000 people. It was the biggest thing we had ever done. We had just played a basement that morning. And then we went and opened up for Jimmy Eat World. And I showed the people at the toy company, I showed Rick the video of us doing that. And he was like, oh, I get it. I understand. You're going to go do this now, because I was showing him that video to say, hey, I got to leave the job. I have to get in the van and do this. This is one of my dreams, you know? So then I do drawings for My Chemical Romance. I develop stuff. I did the second album cover. I worked on the first with a friend. But that was my life for a few years. Just that.
Were there any comics on the road? Like, sometimes you'll see comedians or different people that are touring, but they stop at comic shops along the road.
Yeah.
If you're in Europe or whatever, you know, were you still engaging at all in terms of what you were consuming?
Yes. I couldn't exactly tell you what I was reading, but I would hit the comic shop everywhere we went. You know, I would love to be in Europe, and I would go to and I would love to see how seriously they took comics. Everything was a nice hardcover, and it was all about collections and not single issues in the shop at all, you know? And I would see this stuff, and I would always find these comic shops. I'm trying to remember what I was reading at the time. I'm blanking on it. But the thing that happens that leads me to writing Umbrella is DC just starts reprinting Doom Patrol, Grant's Run. So that first trade comes out, and I read it, and I'm like, oh my God, like I have to do this. Like I have to make a comic at least half as weird as this. You know? So that was the biggest influence that, you know, because I would still miss drawing. Like I'd be on the road and I would think about drawing every once in a while. Like I said, I did draw stuff for the band, so it scratched that itch sometimes. But I missed writing comics. I missed telling stories, you know. And I was trying to be a storyteller with the lyrics, and that kind of scratched the itch sometimes. But it was different. I missed it, and it was a part of my growing up in my teenage years, and I wanted to reconnect with it again. So when I read that first volume of the Doom Patrol reprint, that's when I said, I want to do this. I'm going to make something up, you know.
I have one big My Chemical Romance question.
Yeah.
Do you possess that James Jean cover for Black Parade, man?
No.
No?
I do not. I do not. Let's see. Well, he colored that. He actually, I was just talking to James, and he had sent me the line art for that digitally, broken up into two parts because it was such a long image, you know? So the originals, I'm pretty sure, are just super, super tight pencils, you know? And then he had digitally colored that. But yeah, I probably should have gotten it at the time. I probably should have at least asked him if I could buy it.
No doubt it would have been a steal, man. But I'm thinking, okay, so musician, dude in a band, is now making comics, and the band I think would probably it's a collaborative effort, and being on the road, that seems like a pressure cooker that you have to know how to navigate personalities and basically become a master collaborator. So now you're going to do Umbrella. Where does Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba come from? Because I was introduced to their work by Umbrella Academy. I don't know where they come from beforehand. And I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about the collaborations with people in comics and how operating a band kind of helped the process.
Not only did being in the band help with kind of navigating a collaborative situation, but it also directly influenced the creation and the story of Umbrella Academy, because, you know, Umbrella Academy is dysfunctional family, and so is a band, very much so, you know. And people fall into all different roles. Like there's the mom, there's the dad, and there's, you know, the teenager and the, you know, the rebellious teenager. And there's, you know, so you're navigating all these personalities and trying to be a good collaborator. And so that directly influences Umbrella Academy and the creation of those characters directly. I had drawn all the characters. I did final art of them. I was living in Brooklyn in an apartment at the time, or Queens, I can't remember. And I wrote up a real deal pitch because it was important to me to not take any shortcuts. I really wanted to make sure that Umbrella Academy wasn't a vanity project. It wasn't just going to be something that I just threw my name on, came up with a bunch of characters, and then made somebody else make it. You know.
I'm so glad we got that on the record with you, man, because a lot of people do dismiss
Yeah.
the comics that are done, like say the Method Man comic or something,
Right.
you know,
Right.
where it's like a person obviously leveraging the name they made somewhere else to have this thing done, and it's a
Right.
big fucking jerk off.
Yeah, and you know, so the way Gabrielle and Fabio come into the picture is through our editor Scott, and he sent me like a box of stuff. I was staying at the Oakwoods at the time, making Black Parade, and Oakwoods it's this place where like child actors stay with their parents, and also people shooting porn. And so you're at this really weird apartment complex with all these people and bands making records for major labels. And so Scott sent me a box. And there's a bunch of stuff in it, but there's this one book called Rock and Roll. And it was by both of them, you know. And the original thought Scott had was maybe since the book deals with flashbacks and present day stuff, maybe you have Fabio do the flashbacks and you have Gabrielle do the modern current day stuff. And I liked that idea, but the more I looked at both of their arts, I was like, I think I wanted to stay consistent, so let's keep it to one artist. But I needed to see more of what Gabrielle had done. So I went to House of Secrets, and they had the book he does with Matt Fraction.
Is it Casanova?
Yeah.
Casanova, yeah. So I look at Casanova, and I'm like, wow, this guy's amazing. You know, he'd come a long way since the Rock and Roll book, even though that's what got me interested in them. And I was like, yeah, I think he's going to be great for Umbrella, you know? And so then he came in, and it was quite a while before we actually started the comic because I had to finish making Black Parade. And then I didn't cheat. Like, I wrote the scripts, you know? And they were, like, really dense scripts, you know? Because, again, it was so important to me to not take any shortcuts and to be the real deal, especially since I had come from that background that people had no idea about, you know. So obviously the initial press, some of it for Umbrella Academy is, you know, this rock star, he's making a comic and here it is, and it's probably not going to be good. And
I was just gonna say, yeah, there's so much precedent for
Yeah.
the negative part, man,
Right.
and that's why we're here today, man, because we have to talk to the exception to the rule, you know.
Right. So, but then some of the press, which was interesting, was they would talk about my background. And this is not even the fans of the band at the time knew this background. So there was this whole other side in my whole past that they would talk about in these interviews when they were talking about Umbrella Academy. And they would mention the internship at DC, or that I pitched the show to Cartoon Network and got rejected, or I was designing toys, and, you know, they would talk about all this stuff, you know. But the thing is, we were really excited for Umbrella Academy to come out to like prove a lot of people wrong, because we felt in our hearts it was great, you know. And I knew we had done it the right way, and I didn't take any shortcuts, and I really worked hard at it. I would be scripting before we would go play like an arena. My days were full. I'd wake up at like 10. I would just write until sound check. Headphones on, laptop, writing. I was scripting that way. Then I'd go on stage, do a sound check, come back, do a little more writing, go play the show, and then go to bed, start the process all over again. You know, so I was writing on the road. Anyway, so then Umbrella comes out, and people were like, "Wow, this is actually, you know, a decent comic." You know, yeah, because there is a long history of vanity projects kind of mucking up the waters, I guess. And I totally get that. You know. Like, who am I to be this guy in this rock band and come into comics and just get a comics deal, and, you know, so I get the skepticism.
Gerard, I'm a little curious about your process, since you have come from, you know, writing comics in high school, go to art school, draw some comics, back to writing. Whenever you're writing the script for Umbrella or for any comics you do,
Yeah.
Are you doing thumbnails, or you, I don't know, talk me through a process.
I tried that when I started Umbrella. I actually was having such a hard time starting the script that I felt like I could just visually represent it a lot better. And I was like, I'll just do the layouts, because I knew how to make a comic page. I knew how the panels work. And then I was like, no, this is too much. I want Gabrielle to be able to interpret this stuff. So then I kind of cracked the code, and I just wrote these super dense scripts, that were literally just, and Gabrielle, obviously, he will change stuff, and it's a good collaboration, but the scripts are really dense. And that's it. I just, sometimes I'll handwrite before I go to the typing, but sometimes what would happen with Doom Patrol, there was no time to handwrite. I was so under the gun on that I had to go right to script. I had to sit down and just start having it spill out,
Was your editor on Umbrella Academy, were there things that he did to, I don't know, make it more comic friendly, as an early work of yours? Is that something that he was having some input, or you guys were having conversations about, or?
My conversations with Scott were very in-depth, and it was almost like a crash course again in writing comics. So I had learned in art school, but now I was getting like this, what to me felt like a masterclass education in writing comics. Because of course I start writing the script, and even though I know how to write comics, I'm doing things a little bit as if I'm describing a movie, and I'm doing that. And that's when Scott says, no, you can't write it like this. You need to embrace the format. You need to embrace the comic, make a great comic that works as a comic, because there's all kinds of things that comics can do that movies can't do. And it clicked with me, and I said, oh yeah, I'm just going to use the medium. I'm going to write comics. And it made me go back and look at stuff like Watchmen again and pick up little things where I said, oh, it's the space between the panel that makes this work. Or it's the reader connecting the dots that makes this work, which I read a lot about in Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics as well, which was required reading at SVA. So I got this kind of crash course again, and and he'd give me notes. And sometimes there was an issue in Dallas, the second series, I had to rewrite something like 6 or 8 times because it just wasn't working. He's not afraid to make me go back and do it again.
Very important. A good editor is going to be an extra brain, extra set of eyeballs, a fresh perspective, man, to just make sure that, you get across what you want to communicate, man. So shouts to Scott.
Yeah, like and it was at this point that I really finally fully understood what a good editor does. And I had likened it to making albums. And to me, a great editor is somebody that almost feels like an album producer. They're like getting the best out of you. They'll make suggestions. They'll, really just trying to help you get the best work out of you and make the greatest comic you can make. And to me, that's like a great producer. Like we had Rob Cavallo produce Black Parade, and that's what Rob did. He really tried to get the best out of us. And so it wasn't dissimilar to my relationship with producers.
The panel-to-panel breakdown in comics, like it's very fashionable for people to talk about like the rhythm of the sequencing of panels on a page. And as a musician, do you make note of any inherent rhythms when you're writing, or are a lot of the panel breakdowns the task of the artist?
I am thinking of rhythm a lot. Not only with, to me, the way I construct a page in a script, but also with the way the words are working on the page and how they're impacting. There is like a cadence and a kind of rhythm to the comics. And another thing I sometimes fall back on, in a positive way, I think, but sometimes if I'm ever really in trouble writing a comic, I'll default to the kind of lyricist that I am. And I'll just and I did this a lot in Doom Patrol, like I would just kind of rely on these kind of more poetic, abstract words and get those into the script to convey a feeling if I couldn't have people say it through their word balloons, So I did that a lot in Doom Patrol.
Iambic pentameter is no BS, man. Shakespeare wasn't joking. Killjoys comes next?
Yes, Killjoys comes next.
Did you keep in touch with Becky Cloonan after school, or did you guys kind of like get reacquainted when you jump back into the comic book game?
Well, I actually never met Becky in school. I'm trying to think of where I met Becky. Oh, I met Becky when Umbrella Academy came out. I believe she came to the signing, and that's the first time we met. She came to the Forbidden Planet signing in Manhattan, and she had done this really awesome drawing of Kraken, which we ran in the comic, and that's kind of how we met. And I had known when we started Killjoys, Sean, Simon, and I, we were like, Becky, we have to have Becky do this, you know. But the comic was really different back then. The Killjoys project is an interesting thing because it really evolved and it grew into this other thing. Like, it was the thing I was most obsessed with creatively, so it bled into the music, you know, and then it became a concept album and a comic. And I was hesitant to marry the two things because I felt I had done such a good job of separating the two things. But this one was just so part of my brain that I wanted to make this concept album that connected with a comic. But because of that, I had changed some things about it for the sake of being part of MCR, and I had made things a little more dystopian, a little more like a colorful punk rock post Mad Max thing. There was an evil corporation, because a lot of the album Killjoys is like, it's about art versus commerce. So I wanted to show that, these free and colorful people versus stark white, sterile kind of corporate society. So the story changed a lot, and it really started out about a bunch of teenagers that could bend reality by tapping into their trauma. That's how Killjoys really started. And it's something that I think we'll revisit one day in that form. That took a while to finish that one. It was hard because the band had broken up while it was still coming out. So that was a hard one for me to... It was hard when I'd get the comps. You know, I kind of... There's a lot of hurt there, so it was hard to read. Yeah.
The comic comes out, Umbrella Academy is a thing, known quantity in the industry, man. And so you're going around, you're able to do different conventions all over the place. And was it in South America when you connected with Jim Lee, Dan DiDio?
It was. Yeah.
Let's hear about that a little.
Yeah, the cool thing, all right, so one of my main objectives with even getting back into comics was that I knew that I had a large audience. And since comics were so good to me and changed my life, that I thought they could do that for our audience. So it was really to me to benefit the industry and comic shops. And a lot of comic shop owners, they would come to me and they would say, like, I got like all these new kids in here that never read comics before, and they're all into comics now and stuff like that. So I kind of wanted to use like my powers for good in order to get people into the shops. So I would also do these really long signings. You know, obviously I don't charge for signings. I don't ever do anything like that. I simply do it for free. I sit down. I think one time we did tickets for charity, but and I would sit for them all day. I would do like 11-hour signings and just meet every kid that came in. And so I got invited to Comics Experience in Brazil, which was great because then I could hang out with Gabrielle and Fabio. And yeah, I would have dinner. I had known Jim Lee for a long time, actually, because he became friends with my brother, and Jim was actually in Europe with his wife at some of those Black Parade shows, but he was really tight with Mikey. But then I got invited to dinner with Dan and Jim, and Frank Miller was there, and which was super cool.
That's got to be a trip.
Yeah, it was a trip, and we just kind of, I don't know, it was exciting. We just started talking. They, you know, Dan and Jim were like, "Oh, you have to do something with us. You should you should come write a comic. They had heard about my Batman comic, Kingdom of the Mad, that I wanted to make, and we were talking about that. But I was like, I don't feel like I'm in the right place in my life to write Batman. And I had started to talk to them about Doom Patrol a little bit, because that's what was calling me, you know. And so things just kind of evolved from that conversation.
And evolved into the Young Animal line.
Yeah. You know, another thing I really wanted to do was work with Shelley Bond. She is one of my favorite editors, and she edited a lot of some of my favorite comics.
Another courageous editor over there at DC.
Yeah.
Just want to make note. She brought Paul Pope to DC. We'll bring the conversation full circle. She brought Paul Pope to DC.
She brought Jim Rugg to DC.
The man. She brought Dave Lapham. Her taste levels.
Gilbert
high.
Hernandez, I believe, she opened a door for.
Yeah, so she's awesome, man. We revere Shelley Bond.
Gerard, throw out a couple books. You said, like she had done some of your favorite books. Throw out a couple titles if you can think of them off the top of your head.
I'm pretty sure she did Kill Your Boyfriend.
Yes.
With Philip Bond.
Yeah,
future
Mr. Bond. Yeah.
Invincibles. She did Young Liars, which was, I think, coming out when I was interning there. She has so many credits. I don't want to. Now, of course, I'm blanking on them.
That's great. That's a good selection. I mean, long career there. I think she was there 20 years at least, maybe a little bit more than that.
So you connect with Shelley Bond. Young Animals happens, and then Shelley Bond goes away.
Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah. So for 3 months, Shelley helps me build Young Animal. And I remember, Jim, we called you at one point too, because we were really trying to get really left of center, like really non-mainstream artists to make this stuff. That was definitely.
By the way, not to give away anything, but what you ended up doing in regards to what we talked about, the direction you went, way better than anything I had in mind. So,
really?
Yeah, it was fun to have that conversation, but exciting to see that project come together too. And I mean all of Young Animal, because I remember you were talking about doing different formats and things, and then like a zine preview came out, and I remember seeing that at the store and just being like, this is awesome. I wish there would have been like 100 more of those kinds of things. But pretty interesting as a the whole concept behind that line seemed outside the box.
Yeah, because I had really just become, the older I got and the more I did it, I became super interested in exposing people to more underground, different kinds of art. And I thought you could do that stuff in the world of superheroes and really have it resonate, So kind of in the way that Joey Cavalieri's Bizarro Comics did that. But to me, I saw every single series as like a full comic version of the stuff he'd done in Bizarro, And that was kind of the initial feelings on that. But it all started with Doom Patrol. And Shelley found Nick Darrington.
Bad motherfucker, man. I love that guy's art. I think he, for my money, he's like the dopest artist at DC right now to me. It's the closest stuff art wise they're doing that speaks to me. Yeah,
I agree. And the funny thing about that is Shelley kind of reached out to him on a hunch, because he hadn't done comics in 10 years.
Oh, really? I didn't realize he was like an old dude.
He's not super old, but he was he was in comics. I think he and I are basically the same age. But he was doing animation in Texas, I think. He worked on the Philip K. Dick animated one.
That
Scanner Darkly.
Oh yeah, right.
Scanner Darkly. He was working on that, and he had left comics. He had, he'd only done a few things, and then he went and did animation. And just on a whim, Shelley reached out to him.
Wow.
And said, are you interested? And we hadn't even seen what his art looked like now. We'd just seen what it looked like 8 years ago, And she said, what do you think about drawing Doom Patrol? And he was like, huh. He's like, yeah, I think I can get back into comics, And he sent this drawing over of Cliff sitting on a couch or subway. I think it was a couch. And I was like, this is the art in my head. This is what I want Doom Patrol to look like, And I love his art, and I feel very close to his art in terms of the kind of art that I would want to make or see. Where Nick and I draw upon a lot of the same influences, like Atomo and Jaime Hernandez, and we're pulling upon the same stuff, and we definitely share a brain to a certain extent, you know. But I have like an image, you know, I could show you for the coloring book project we're doing. I'm releasing an old image that I had done for this comic project that never came out. But if you look at my art and you look at Nick's, like they're in the same family, they have the same energy. I'm not nearly as good as him, but you could definitely tell that he and I probably would have been convention buddies. So yeah, he draws to me in the way that it's perfect in my head. You know?
We didn't tell you that this conversation is an intervention to convince you to draw some of your own comics within the next couple of years, man.
I know. I think about it. Yeah, you were so encouraging about that Phantom 5 drawing I did. That was really cool.
It was a great piece, man. But
thank you.
You know what? It just occurred to me that in the Cave Carson book, kayfabe Lieutenant Tom Scioli did some work in there, man. We got to give salutes to him and Gerard. Tell us a Tom story or two.
My God.
Because I know them all, and I just want to hear it from your voice.
Yeah. First of all, that was literally one of my top 3 favorite things we did at Young Animal. Like, to me, when I read American Barbarian, I was like, this dude is unhinged. Unhinged.
Great adjective.
Crazy imagination, you know? Just insane. And I was like, he's got to, you know, so then I reached out to him and I was like, I just got this thing at DC and we could use superheroes and stuff. And we started talking about the superpowers toys. And at first it started off as something like, maybe it'll be about the toys. This is kind of how I pitched it to Dan DiDio in order to get away with it. I was like, it'll just be about the toys, not the real heroes. And you just got to think about it that way. But then, like, basically Tom just went nuts with the whole universe of DC. And sadly, it got pulled away from us. There was some wild stuff in there.
An example or two?
Oh yeah, well, for sure. Well, yeah, there was many things. You know, there was at one point I think he had Wonder Woman tied up to a satanic pentagram, an inverted pentagram with her lasso, I believe. Just stuff that I knew right off the bat before showing it to anybody else that we weren't going to be able to do. There's this one panel where he was showing Green Arrow's junk because he was on an island and he was naked, and that got flagged. And then there was one time where the Joker, I don't even know if I should say this, one time, it just shows you, though, how unhinged his imagination is. There's a line, he had the Joker talking to the reader, and the Joker says to the reader that he...
Couldn't use that?
What?
You guys couldn't use that?
No. And again, this is another thing that I flagged before anybody else. I was like, Tom, we can't do that. There's like no way in hell we'd be able to do that in a comic. You know, man, it was so great working with him on that. I did very little. I literally just gave him the keys to the kingdom, and he just, you know, made an amazing thing.
To run an imprint and to kind of design an imprint, once again, I can't help but think that the experience that you've accumulated working with a band and navigating all those waters must have come into play to get to set all those pieces in motion.
Well, that was what was fun about working with all the creators of Young Animal, because, you know, and then in the years since the band had broken up, I had learned hard lessons by that band breaking up, and I learned how to become an even better collaborator, you know? And so it was very easy with all the creatives, you know, very easy with them. Like, I just wanted them to be the best they could, to do the craziest stuff they can. And that was the stuff I responded to, you know? But it's one of those things. I find often in my life, it comes back to art versus commerce, you know, and corporate culture is a killer, man. You know, working with a corporation is not easy, especially if you're trying to do really different stuff, you know? So,
I have to ask you,
yeah.
I think it was Doom Patrol #1. There was a Brian Chippendale variant cover.
Yes.
I'm a huge Chippendale Fort Thunder fan.
Cool.
Is that your I mean, I have to assume that's your doing. How do you know his work and his art, and any Brian Chippendale story there?
There's not a lot of stories, although we still talk all the time. I'm just a huge fan of his stuff. And I think I was introduced to him through Matt Fraction. Because I think Matt followed him on Twitter or would retweet some of his tweets or art. This is back when I used Twitter. And so then the first thing I heard before really seeing his art, I think I saw a little art, but then I heard Lightning Bolt.
Mm-hmm.
And then I heard Black Pus, his solo project. And I just got super into it. And I was like, this guy, another person to me that is completely unhinged. Like, just totally pure art all the time, spills out of him. He's playing the drums with a crazy mask on. He's making these really insane comics. And I went and saw Black Pus perform at this place called The Smell in LA. And I was like, this is like, it had been the first time that I had been to like a real underground show in a long time. And I loved the energy, you know. And we hung out. I gave him some Umbrella Academy comics. And then I just been waiting to work with him. And then so when Doom Patrol happened, I was like, will you do a variant cover, you know?
It seems like such an unlikely pairing to see a Brian Chippendale artwork on a DC comic. So pretty cool.
It's always great when these rare kind of things happen, man, because it actually requires a guy like you, Gerard, to make that happen. The Marvel example would have been
Gary Panter on Omega the Unknown.
Yeah, and that's Jonathan Latham who was flexing his muscle to get, you know, an interesting cartoonist into that kind of limelight. Yeah. If you want to call it limelight. Gary does well on his own.
Sure.
So we're coming to the end, man. We've used a bunch of your time. We got to promote the quarantine coloring book before we get out of here. One of the things, though, man, just to bring things full circle and to talk about, like, you know, what you said about you using your powers for good and all that. Whenever you did that tweet for me for the free comic book day, absolutely generated future like Hip Hop Family Tree readers, future Ed Piscor readers, and I'm friends with some of these people to this maybe a half dozen people personally that were introduced to my comic because of your tweet. So that was a very generous thing for you to do, and I totally appreciate it, man. But let's talk about the task at hand, like what's going on right now, your current possible comic book stuff. But let's put the word out for the quarantine coloring book.
Sure. Yeah. The quarantine coloring book on Instagram. There's also a website with that address. It's just thequarantinecoloringbook.com. It's all free art. We just wanted to put something together for people in quarantine to pass the time or distract themselves. Was the idea of my friend Sarah Taylor, who sings in a band called Youth Code, and I just kind of climbed on board to help her. We put out a new piece of art every day. We feature people's colorings in the stories feed. It's just been a real positive and amazing project so far. And I actually asked Jim, when I reached out to Tom, I asked if you would do one because I don't have your info.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, we can connect after this.
All right, cool. Yeah. So yeah, it's just this cool free art. And in some ways it's like an extension. At least the artist that I bring into it, it's an extension of Young Animal in a certain way. Because I'm like, you know, I asked you for one, and I asked Tom for one, and I asked Brian Chippendale for one. So it's like all these people that I was trying to make underground comics with.
That's awesome. It's nice to put together a bunch of artists I like.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a cool thing, and I see people putting it to use, man, doing like little Instagram stories showing off the stuff that they've been coloring that day, and it seems to help. You know, like that's become a part of. We all have to create new routines in the midst of the chaos we're all living in, and the quarantine coloring book is a part of a lot of people's routines, man. To just get some of that nervous energy out, those nervous hands that you see Eddie P throwing about in these damn interviews, man. Get those hands moving, get that shit going on. But Gerard, before we split, man, comics-wise, what do we have to look forward to, man?
Yeah. Well, right now, literally right now, aside from doing this interview, I'm writing volume 4 of Umbrella Academy.
You heard it here first, folks. Probably
Yes.
not, but you still heard it here.
I think, well, people knew I was supposed to start writing it, but I did now start writing it. So Gabrielle is eagerly waiting for pages. I'm in the midst of the first script right now, and it's moving. It's trucking along. So that's the main thing. We have the You Look Like Death, the Seance miniseries coming out. It's one other thing I can't announce yet, but I touched upon it earlier in the interview. Maybe not super earlier, but at some point I touched upon it. And but that's it. Like my main
Faust
focus
comic.
Right yeah, Faust comic.
David Quinn collaborations.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I cut you off, man.
No, it's all good. No, it's all good. Yeah, that's it. My main focus is Umbrella Academy right now.
Super cool, man. Jimmy, you got one to
That's
end
good,
it on?
man. I feel very satisfied with this.
Gerard, great conversation, dude.